So, with Lane's permission, I he told me it was all good to read this. So, this was a very interesting and very in-depth critique of fascism, something you don't really see on the internet too often, something that he himself admits in his own writings. So, let's actually start jumping into this soon because this is actually going to be pretty interesting because you don't really get stuff like this very often. And it's a long read, so if it's going to be a long read, I might as well get my ass started sooner than later. Internet fascist culture thug stated in an interview with pretentious Irish twink Keith Woods, which can be seen here, that he would love to hear an honest critique of what he called third positionism, a gay post war term that I hate to use. This may get one to ask how unread this man is. However, it is not that Culture Thug is unread, but that he reads into things whatever he wants to read into them, shown by his treatment of Werner Sombart, citing one chapter and ignoring the ones before. There are many honest critiques of, as CT calls it, third positionism by people who have read the history and theory. Just to think of a short one off the top of my head, we have Varieties of Fascism by Eugene Weber. In fact, I think CT would like this book as it is more about giving history than an attack, but attacks of fascism are given throughout. It also does not help that the attacks of anti fascists have been so poor. Very true. The poor attacks made by anti fascists have only strengthened fascist internet LARPers. You have people like Umberto Eco who fail to attack fascism and go as far as to say things like the theory should never be looked at. Same with memes like fascism is capitalism in decay. All that only strengthens the sewer made up of socially retarded closet homosexuals, authoritarian fantasies being a product of pseudo masculine, repressed homosexuality. However, to say that you can't find those attacks made by people who read the theory would mean that you never looked for it. The honest attack of fascism came not just from the left, but about also right with people like Augusto Del Noce, who is friends with fascist thinker Hugo Spirito. It is not like fascism or Nazism built an amazing doctrine, so there is no need to lie to take it down. In fact, historian A. James Greger pointed out that in the study of Nazi race theory, for the time that Nordicism was accepted, it was only because they were desperate for an actual racial doctrine. The Nazis were desperate for the thing that made National Socialism what it was, the theory of race. The fact that Nazism was desperate for an actual racial doctrine shows the quality of German National Socialism. It ended up adopting a view that was so autistic that they had to reject it. Fascism also did not build any amazing doctrine. Its philosophy and its idealism was poor. Then there is also the fact that to be a fascist or a Nazi is just a LARP here in America. Calling yourself a fascist or a Nazi has no meaning. George Lincoln Rockwell was not a Nazi, but something worse. Beyond his glowing connections, he agrees with little of Nazism proper. One of Alfred Rosenberg's few good takes is seen in his memoirs when he speaks on Oswald Mosley. He says Nazi organizations outside of Germany to be an oil in the fire of the existing propaganda against us. And also that Oswald Mosley should not have called himself a fascist, but should have built his own British movement. These were but built for a specific time and place and not to be exported elsewhere. Yeah, exactly. It was supposed to be very exclusive. Oh, good to see you there, Angelina. Yeah, that's an interesting point, 90. It wouldn't shock me about Rockwell. I mean, there were like a couple Jewish people in his group. And then, of course, Rockwell gets murdered by an Italian man, which is kind of funny. Now, I've spent some time in online fascist circles and have come to view that they are bad people. I have come to the view that it is nothing but a sewer full of rats. Absolutely disgusting people make up the so called movement. That is one of my motivations for making this. One problem, however, is with attacking turd positionism as CT wants, is that you can't is that you can't. Beyond the fact that it is a gay post war term that shouldn't be used, you cannot take down rightism or leftism. Fascism, I would say, is a form of less leftism. If I was to attack the third position for being nationalist, that would even be untrue. In German National Socialism, as pointed out, and Hitler's Revolution by Richard Tedor, you can start to get the idea of pan Europeanism. This was used by the Nazis to gain help for the war effort. As de Grelle would state, we fought neither for Germany nor for Hitler, but for a much greater ideal, the creation of a United States of Europe. However, also people like Himmler wanted to use the pan Europe idea in a Germany first way to dominate over the rest of Europe. German Europeanism would become a stronger post war with people like Francis Parker Yockey and Oswald Mosley. Moreover, in America, they have not been nationalist. Ezra Pound sided with Italy in World War II. Yockey wanted to use the USSR to weaken America, and the part black Lawrence Dennis supported Central America against U.S. imperialism. Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera once attacked nationalism correctly, stating that nationalism is the individualism of the peoples. And I will get into there is an incompatibility between Gentili's philosophy and nationalism. Point is I can't say third positionism is even nationalist. There is not much I could ever say about it. So I'll mostly be looking into Italian fascism. I will also be looking more into the theory than the historical practice. It would be wrong to attack Marxism by first starting with the Soviet Union, North Korea, or the Khmer Rouge. If anything, the main problem Marxists face is not anything that happened in them, but the fact that they happened where they did. It would not be the best to start with theory as a historical practice. It is something else. I will also be doing something like what Gentili does to Marxism. Gentili takes Marxism to its materialism and shows it to be bad materialism, almost more like an idealism. So I'll be starting with the idealist base as everything else comes out from there. I will also have to explain Gentili's philosophy as no one reads him. Gentilian's revolt against nature. So I will be doing something like what Herbert Marcuse of the Franklin School does in Reason and Revolution. He says things like his philosophy when judged by its content and not its language. It has nothing to do with Hegel, and also stating Hegel's politics. There is no concept less compatible with fascist ideology than which founds the state on a universal and rational law that safeguards the interest of every individual. Whatever the contingencies of this natural and social status, Marcuse gives what may be one of the most mixed attacks on fascism. It is good that he starts off pointing in the direction for a good, honest attack on the fascist philosophy, better than most intellectual critics of fascism, but he could not help but to take into some absurd places and ends up accusing Gentili of similar crimes to those that he himself is guilty of. He, for example, states that Gentili was not truly an idealist because of his view of the mind and body, and also he was more of a positivist without much of an explanation. For Italian Catholic philosopher Augusto Del Noce and also the Marxist Diego Fusaro, and I will cite Fusaro as Gentili does Labriola, it is best to understand Gentili and also fascism in relation to Marx, Hegel, and Spaventa. Diego Fusaro gives, in one quote, an excellent description of actualism and its birth in one of his lectures. I agree that Gentili goes beyond Hegel, or at least does not coincide with Hegel. Gentili, following Spaventa's steps, criticized what Spaventa had already criticized. In Hegel, the identification between thought and being is conceived in a static sense, as if it was already accomplished once and for all, as if this identity was indeed motionless, fetishized, we could almost say fixed. Whereas in Marx, who is certainly an idealist, but in a more rigorous and radical terms, praxis considered as the foundation of reality. We nevertheless see no fixed identity of object and subject, because this identity is made dynamic through the continuous renewal by praxis. Praxis creates over and over a new relationship between subject and object. For this reason, in the reform of the Hegelian dialectic, Gentili's intention is to revise Hegel by introducing the concept of action. Gentili's version of praxis. Because the identity of being and thought cannot be seen as static, it is only as a dynamic. It is therefore not so much an identity of being and thought, but an identity of being and thinking and action, as there is no static identity of thought and being, but there is an identity of being and thinking and action, which by very action of thinking defines being. So it is the action of doing that guarantees this identity of thought and being. I'm talking about the well known distinction Gentili makes between a thought that is thought and thinking about thought. A thought that is thought is a thought objectified, and it manifests as the objects that surround us. We never encounter any objects disconnected from the thought action that created them. We only have objects that have been thought, objects that are the outcome of our thoughts. That's an interesting way of putting it, isn't it? The materialism of Marx is ironically one of the most important forms of idealism and the creation of actualism. So we must speak of Gentili's work in the philosophy of Marx. I have myself edited the translation of this work from Zoltanus. Fusaro points out the similarity of the pure act of thinking of praxis. However, praxis for Gentili in Marx takes a much deeper meaning than the mere get off your assism that you hear from the internet left on the topic of praxis. For Gentili, we give things like the thesis on Feuerbach, we find that the new materialism is in fact in idealism. Marx says the problem with the old materialism is that the object, actuality, sensuousness are conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, not as a human sensuous activity. Practice, not subjectively. Marx even says the materialists have to learn from the idealist in the following sentence. Marx says that in the thesis on Feuerbach that the old materialism could not be revolutionary, and so the new materialism must take from idealism. The problem, however, is that it stops being materialism. Marx's so-called materialism is more like moral subjectivist who admits to the role that the reason must play in morality. Rudolf Steiner's ethical individualism, for example. Reason by its nature is universal, and so moral subjectivism could not be subjectivist. And when Marx starts to bring in the ideals of reality formed by praxis, he has trouble being a materialist. This is more than a mere get off your assism, but even if it was just that, it would show a great level of idealism as it shows humans have free will. It is sad that most of the online left will look at these theses of Feuerbach as a mere get off your assism and a belief in free will. When Marx shows Feuerbach as unable to understand human society, that is not like it is for Marx the fault of the old materialism, but in truth, all materialism, thus for Gentili and Diego Fusaro, the idea of praxis and the pure act of thinking are similar. However, Marx still, for Gentili, did not take hold to that beautiful flower of idealism. Me and Fusaro say that they are similar, but not the same. As Gentili points out, Marx's praxis is a subjective production of man. A production, however, of sensory activity, not of thought. Thus Marx for Gentili may still be said to be a materialist, and he did not swim the waters of idealism, but only got deep enough to cover his legs. To quote Gentili, the passage, therefore, from a posteriori to a priori, as the reason for reality, is to understood in idealism, but in Marx's materialism, it is inconceivable. It is also true that Marx, for Gentili, did not get past the nominalistic intuition, which sees in society nothing but individuals. There is a reason Gentili wrote the theory of mind as pure act and not the theory of mind as praxis. It's an interesting point right there. For Gentili, this praxis idea shows an idealism that Marx also does not get past materialism. Marx does not seem to have taken the slightest care to see how praxis could be coupled with matter as the only reality, while the whole of time preceding history of philosophy must have warned him the irreconcilability of the two principles of that form with the content, which is praxis and matter. To say praxis was the only reality was the project of Gentili, and so, for this reason, Augusto Del Noce puts the Gentili's work, The Philosophy of Marx, as the genesis of fascism. Augusto Del Noce is half right in doing so. Now we start to see the birth of Gentili's actualism. The importance of both Marx and Spaventa is not made so clear in the theory of mind as pure act. However, we see importance of Marx still leak through at times, like how he viewed one of the reasons the Greeks did not reach his views, like his of the ancient philosophy never did conceive history progress. He even further in the book states that the problem with mixing history and eternity led Plato to deny the value of history. The fact that Gentili sees philosophy of history as important in the way shows the impact of Marx. Gentili also seems to agree with Karl Lowith that the Greeks did not care for history and had no philosophy of history. This view in Philosophy and Hope, Fusaro himself calls simplistic and superficial, and Polybius, we see not a history, but a circular philosophy of history. Fusaro also states Epicurus had preferred the hope of a different future to an inexorable necessity advocated by the physicist. Gentili's idealism, unlike the Greek idealism, however, was born out of the philosophy of history. Gentili, despite what Herbert Marcuse wants you to think, was an idealist, and he gives an argument for idealism that sounds like the argument given by a lot of other idealists. Reality is conceivable only so far as the reality conceived is in relation to the activity which conceives it. And the relation, it is not only a possible object of knowledge, it is a present and actual one. To conceive reality is to conceive, and at the same time as one with it, the mind in which the reality is represented. And therefore, the concept of a material reality is absurd. One quote sums up this form of idealism, I meant to say his, but needs to be explained to show how. Hegel infamously wrote a preface attacking prefaces. Like a preface in philosophy, a quote makes more sense after you already know how they think. The spirit is never really the pure theoretical activity that is imagined to stand in opposition to practical activity. There is no theory or contemplation of reality that is also not action. Thus, the creation of reality, indeed, there is no cognitive act that does not have value, or rather, that is not judged, precisely so far as it is a cognitive act, according to its exact conformity to its own law, and whether or not it is recognized as being what it ought to be. If we were not authors of our ideas, or rather, our ideas were not purely our own actions, they would not be ours. We would be unable to judge them. They would have no value, and they would be neither true nor false. Gentili holds the reality as our act of thinking. Thinking for him is universal, and something outside of our thinking is something outside of reality. His view has been attacked as solipsism, and Gentili responds to this attack. The problem for Gentili is solipsism holds to a particular and negative ego, and actualism holds on to a dialectical ego, and moreover, makes itself a thing and not a spirit. It can exclude other egos. We must think about other minds, and we must have unifications with other minds, and without such there can be no understanding. It is not my mind or your mind or our mind. He even speaks of an infinite ego, infinite unity. Diego Fusaro, that this can be seen as an attempt to reclaim monistic perspective, to draw everything back to the unity of thinking, though. The dialectical concept of mind then not only does not exclude, it requires spiritual multiplicity as the essential mark of an infinite unity of mind. Infinite unity is therefore infinite unification of the multiple, as it is the infinite multiplication of this of the one. Hegel, being an absolute idealist, in contrast to the subjective idealism of Gentili, first sees in the old Platonic idealism, which persisted throughout Aristotelian, Neoplatonist, and scholastic and Cartesian intellectualist metaphysics. Right through Kant, the spirit is removed. Is mind there is more like a substance or a thing or finished event. This, for Gentili, is not truly a spiritual view. The idea, the absolute, is not spirit, but the object and the presupposition of spirit. It is an object that cannot be identified with the spirit without annulling itself as spirit of process. In doing so, it collapses into a simple presupposition of an ulterior spiritual position in relation to what it becomes a knowable reality. For Gentili, our thought is an act or a process, not substance. And as for the old idealism, it declared to be a substance, by which it meant that it was the subject of an activity of which it was independent, an activity, therefore, which it could not realize or not realize without thereby losing or gaining its own being. In our view, the mind has no existence apart from its manifestations, and for these manifestations are according to its own inward and essential realization. We can also say that our mind, that is in our experience, as long as we do, by experience, we must mean the act of experiencing, pure experience, that which is living and real. Now, modern idealism, starting with Kant, had one important figure, and that was Hegel. For Gentili, Hegel started a revolution in idealism that he did not finish, as Hegel understood the impact of the Kantian view. The transcendental ego of Kant is not substance but thought. And here we say thought cannot be making the old and the new understanding of mind clear. When we are speaking of thought, we are speaking of mind as an act. For Gentili, not even Berkeley understood this understanding of mind as thought. Although Berkeley identified representation with the existence of that which is perceived, his conception has nothing to do with negation, Kantian or Hegelian thought, which is the act of thinking activity, which also understood Berkeleyan representation as something presupposed by thought. It is with Hegel, therefore, that we see the beginning of our new idealism. Of the new idealism. Sorry. If words just seem to pop up where they don't belong when I'm talking. An idealism that can no longer be called naturalism, but something akin to spiritualism. Hegel, as stated, did not follow the revolution to the end. He still had elements of the old Platonic view which he could not shake off. Thus, this view for Gentili is divided. On one hand, it presents itself as an activity that thinks, and on the other, as a reality understood as both object and presupposition of thought. And in both, we see the old Platonic view rearing its head. They both hold reality that has transcended the act of thought. In Hegel, we see the reason of the world and also pure nature, and thus we may say that Gentili grew out of the philosophy of Kant and Hegel. But for Gentili, because of these elements in Hegel, it is Gentili's goal to take Hegel to the next step. For Gentili, the older forms of idealism were too close to materialism, so he wants to make a more extreme form of idealism, as he states in his lecture, The Rebirth of Idealism. Thus, the dominant character of current idealism, rebelling against the naturalist movement, is to negate nature and oppose it to the spirit. Either idealist monism, which solves the problem by denying its existence, or else dualism, which acknowledges the problem but declares itself powerless to solve it. In neither case is there any real understanding of idealism. And since what is not understood is not in the spirit, well, idealism can be nowhere else but in the spirit. I claim that real idealism is missing in both cases. Gentili sees the problem in Hegel as another Hegelian. Bertrando Spaventa on other than Gentili, may be the most important thing in the formation of actualism. Reading his essay on pure experience and historical reality and the lecture Rebirth of Idealism make the importance of Spaventa clear. Like how Jacob Boehme is the only spoken and the once in the science of logic, in the remark of quality and negation in the chapter of determinate being. Despite his huge impact on Hegel, Gentili says little of Spaventa and theory of the mind as pure act. Gentili follows the stupid Spaventian attack of the old idealism and of Hegelianism, and so there must be a new idealism in which that of the naturalistic world is removed. The new idealism must view no reality outside of knowledge. Spaventa here is a needed upheaval in the whole Hegelian system to iron out these seeming contradictions, and Hegel found by Spaventa and Gentili. One may say that we see this contradiction already in the preface to the Phenomenology, if we take, for example, in 17. However, Hegel is right that the only way to grasp substance is it as subject, just as morality is subjective universality. It must be this way, for substance can only be made for itself, only for us. In other words, so that it can only be in self, also for self. This in self and for self is explained well by Hegel in the preface to Phenomenology, and in the Encyclopedia, Hegel gives us what is to be taken a proto-feminist line and relating to such things. This does seem like an odd attack, as Hegel is the master of contradiction. Hegel is the man who shows the unity of being and nothing, of the finite and the infinite. In fact, in his encyclopedia, Hegel uses the thing's natural being when outlining his method. In other words, Hegel is after what the thing is. At the end of Science of Logic, Hegel says that nature and spirit are in general different modes of presenting its existence. So both exist in the absolute idea, just as being and nothing have becoming, as the whole and the parts of force that we see in nature and spirit have the absolute idea. And I don't remove fascism from the title of Hegelian because it did historically come from Hegel. But I think you can see how this one move is almost like a full rejection of Hegel. As Enrico Corradini stated, fascism took the secession of socialism and went beyond it. Gentili, in his view, did the same to Hegel. Gentili found Hegelian idealism as Hegel had left it, and felt to correct the mistake in Hegel's absolute idealism to fix it. Spaventa viewed the naturalistic element to be dialectic had to be removed. However, as I will get into after, I'm done explaining Gentili, as he found himself in the worst unresolvable contradiction by removing nature. His pure experience in historical reality shows us how this idealism works. Speaking on the Divine Comedy, the comedy is a creation of those who study it. It is not just some poem from 1320, as it is the comedy that we study as the creation of those who study it that is real. A divine poem from 1320 is nothing but an abstract. Just try securing in thought something we assume to be already determined. That is, the very act will be a new creation in which will resuscitate the process. This means that self-consciousness is, in its individuality, is formed in the infinite, and this individuality cannot therefore be divided into multiple discrete individuals, but in continuous process of individuation. The same can be said of the Divine Comedy, for example, which is not, strictly speaking, a work of certain individual imagination, undertaking in the narrow confines of the life of a man who died in 1321. That would be an abstraction. The real Divine Comedy is that which we read, which we interpret, and in which we cast judgment. This is our work, which extends the process by which we establish the spiritual creation that we call the comedy. Is carried out across a series of centuries. It is tangled up in the whole progress of the spirit and flows into the general current of thought of culture. Pure experience and historical reality is also a good text for putting Gentili into his context of the history of philosophy. However, true history for Gentili is only an abstract. The history that we make up is the true history. Is there even a point in doing history? What we believe about history is truth. Historical truth is not things as they happened way back when, but when we make up now. I have an idea how Gentili would respond to my question. Why even do real history? And I will respond soon. With all this in mind, it is not hard to understand the relativistic nature of the proper fascist view and rejection of fascism of natural law, as in Rocco's political doctrine of fascism. Natural law is rejected as liberal. To attack natural law for being absurd. To attack natural law for being liberal is absurd. Natural law, I would argue, like many things that come from the Greek philosophy, is older and goes back to the old days of Egypt, but more than feeding into liberalism, it would be impossible to build a natural law under this idealism. Okay, and see, this is something that I noticed, like Andrew Wilson of the Crucible critiqued about fascism, is he acted like Gentili was not a philosopher because he's a deontologist, and deontologists tend to believe in natural law. And because fascism doesn't really teach, the idea of natural law, I could kind of see where that criticism comes from. Although that's one of the few times I'll give Andrew some credit because, I mean, there are times where he gets stuff wrong. But the idea of something outside of our act of thinking is impossible here. Now, on another note, we may speak of how Gentili views God. For the Hegelians in the Anglosphere, God has held an important role in their idealism. It would be hard to think of Anglos in America and England holding the same lack of belief in God as McTaggart. Gentili holds that his idealism is compatible with Christianity and Catholicism. However, he holds God to be a man God. Es dues in nobis, God is within us. Here there is a spiritual unity of man and God, but moreover, it is a reality which waits for us to construct, a reality which is true even now of love and will, because it is the inward effort of the soul. It is living process. It is not its ideal and external model. It is man himself who rises above humanity and becomes God. And see, this is a problem I have with Marxism as well, is man replaces God. And if man becomes God, man as a fallen creature makes decisions that a perfect God would not do. So the mistakes of man and the error of man is not the same as a perfect creator. So that's a big problem because I do not think man put in the highest position of authority can ever make perfect decisions. And history always proves that they don't. And even God is no longer a reality of who already is, but the God who is begotten in us and is ourselves insofar as we have our whole being rise to him. Here, mind is no longer intellect, but will. The world is no longer what is known, but what is made. And therefore, not only can we begin to conceive the mind as freedom or moral activity, but the whole world of the Christian is freed and redeemed. The whole world is a world which, what it would be, are a world, as we say, essentially moral. This then brings us to the idiotic form of Christianity and Catholicism. We are starting to see how this idealism has perverted the fascist view of Christianity and Catholicism. I will take one more quote from Gentili on the topic. Christianity develops through the history of modern thought. You could say that its whole development consists in gradually freeing itself from the perception of the transcendence of the good in order to either become aware of its actual spirituality or in order to grasp the act by which the spirit realizes itself. That is to say, it consists entirely in the progressive overcoming of the opposition between the will and the intellect, or between what is nature and what is ought to be spiritual reality. So being is not opposed to what ought to be, but is contained within, and the real, the old real that is not opposed to the ideal. Rather, the real contained within the ideal, and the ideal realizes itself as the negation of the real that it comprises. So the world is idealized, spiritualized, and completely illuminated in order to become free. Spiritual and moral world, the moral world and its doctrine of the pure act is neither some golden age nor paradise without evil. It is a contrast between good and evil, a struggle to achieve the joy of the spirit, a joy that can only be tasted through effort. As a result of hard fought achievement, it is a world that is only insofar as it is realized a world that is moral and fieri a moral act. Diego Fusaro points out the incompatibility with this in Christianity. I will later use Fusaro to show the incompatibility with Gentilianism and Gentili's own nationalism. Catholic philosophy regards Gentili's actualism as its most dangerous enemy because what does Gentili's actualism do in practice? It doesn't simply deny God, it also deifies man. We could almost say that it bestows upon man a certain task that the scholars have attributed only to God, transforms man into the creator of his destiny, confers man to the competence previously owned only by God himself. Therefore, we find in Gentili this radical form of humanism. And this is also why people need to stop calling reactionaries or religious people fascist, because religious people, especially people that embrace the divinity of God by nature, are not fascist, because a fascist doesn't believe that God and man in the way the Bible does, because the fascist believes in the idea of the man God, and because the man God is the mover of history, the maker of things, that alone um, puts people who are firm believers of Christ away from the fascist framework. So this whole anti-fascism that puts in the right as an element of fascism, which it isn't, because fascism is really in its nature just a degenerated form of leftism, which took on nationalist. And the reason why I say it's degenerated, because nationalism, which it will later talk, which Lane will later talk about in part two, the nationalism pretty much dilutes the whole syndicalism that influenced it. And nationalism pretty much breaks apart a lot of other elements. And as something that was meant to be modern and progressive, it actually kind of stagnated and didn't really. It slowly developed into what it was hoping to become, but it also fell apart later on. And that's something that us today need to learn from. We need to learn from what is the best way to put a society, to bring a society together under a collective effort, under a collective goal, and what is the best foot forward to go to. So anyways, let's go back to this, which finally brings us to the last part, his ethics, as both of the quotes also tie into that. I will spend less time here because I want to run into the attack on idealism, and after the idealism falls apart, so do his ethics. As stated, fascism rejects natural law. And see, this is why I'm not a fascist anymore, or a third positionist, because I don't reject natural law. And if you reject natural law, you usually end up becoming a utilitarian, and because I'm not a utilitarian, therefore, I'm also not a fascist. And the ideas of actuality and rationality, as they are in Hegel's ethics, are impossible here. Gentili views this act of thinking as ethical, not as much as what is created. One of the greatest moral writings on Gentili's eyes is Hypocrite, and that is, what is good thinking, weeding out the true from the false. Not engaging in the thought of others is evil, however, ended in an anti realist constructivist morality, as pointed out by James Wakefield. Gentili's moral philosophy represents a radical variety of anti realism, distinguished by other anti realist doctrines by its rigorous adherence to the necessarily subjective standpoint of the thinker actively reflecting on the choices with which he is confronted. Gentili is right in agreeing with the idealism that followed Jacob Boehme. Boehme was a full idealist. See the fifth point in his six mystical points for proof of viewing freedom as one of the highest good. For Boehme, as Robin Waterfield states, the essential nature of the undetermined divinity is freedom. The idealism to follow after Boehme of Hegel and Schelling, freedom is the highest good. Gentili also correctly put freedom as one of the highest goods. However, his ethics are about more than freedom. An argument is to be made that Gentili's idealism allows more freedom than Hegel's. After all, Now, after all, there is no will but the human will. However, such a brain dead argument that idealist absolutism leaves no room for individual free action were already responded to by Hegel and Schelling. Rudolf Steiner is right to say monism is freedom philosophy, but he is wrong in his views on moral law. Moreover, it is not the idealism of Hegel, but that of Gentili that destroys freedom. I am now done explaining. Forgive me for how long it was. And now we'll start to the attack on idealism, then show how it destroys freedom. For Hegel, the basis of right is, in general, mind. Its precise and point of origin is the will. The will is free, so that freedom is both the substance of right and its goal, while the system of right is the realm of freedom made actual. The world of mind is brought forth out of itself forth a second nature. I will start by stating that this idealism was already responded to by Hegel himself. Not only that, but as early as 1803 in his essay on natural law, there he says, it is the absolute which makes philosophy a genuine science. And in the science of logic, he later says, a philosophy which ascribed veritable, ultimate, absolute being to finite existence as such would not deserve the name of philosophy. What this shows is that, in a way, what Gentili does not may be called philosophy. One may ask what you should debate a fascist. No, mixed up. One may ask why you should debate a fascist, and the truth is there is no point. Gentili put truth in a very important spot in his philosophy, but his truth is not truly true. When we debate, we are looking for truth. However, under subjective idealism, what can be said to be true? And that's why when I did that debate with phenomics, there was nothing really to work with because this ideology or this method of philosophy is, is a lot, is fairly alien to most people. And it's kind of very subjective in a ways. And I'm not a person that likes to lie. If I was the type of person that loved tall tales, dishonesty, and being like just disingenuous in general, then I could just, make pull anything out of my ass. But that's not the kind of person that I am. And the problem in that debate is I started making more material arguments than idealist arguments because truth is I'm not really an idealist, but I also really don't like when me and Phenomics have like had discussions after that debate. I still don't agree with Phenomics on certain areas, not because I'm an idealist or a materialist, but because I am a realist. And Phenomics is not necessarily an idealist, but somewhere kind of more in between that and materialism, because Phenomics is a pretty big fan of John Stuart Mill, and myself, I'm not really like a huge John Stuart Mill fan. Myself, I kind of prefer, Christopher Lash, Russell Kirk, Oswald Spengler, people like that. However, under subjective idealism, what can be said to be true? Truth would need something more absolute and universal. Fascists have no need to be honest. If they universalize their thinking, then it is truth. Myth can become reality. As I said, speaking on Gentili's history, is there even a point in doing history? Gentili would say there is, and that it is tied up with the ethical creation of reality and that weeding out of error, which for Gentili, error is only abstract. To take hold of truth, however, fascism has no room for truth, so there is no point in debating a fascist. And that's kind of why, Antifa, when they say don't debate these people, they kind of do make a good point there. Because if you're debating someone who can just use mythical language and has a purely idealistic way of thinking, whatever they think can basically be whatever actions they take. And it doesn't have to be rational, it doesn't have to be true. It just has to be whatever a lot of times it just feels over reals. So I mean, when Antifa says don't debate these people, it's not really an act of cowardice. It's just more of a fact that if you step into a debate with someone who is, and really, let's be honest here, like, there aren't really too many people on YouTube that are like legit 100% fascist content creators. Like, there was only like barely a handful at most. And even then, like, a lot of them just transitioned away from it. So, so really that just limits things to like Cultured Thug, who's really more of a national socialist and a Nietzschean. Um, then you have Zoltanus, who's not really 100% Italian fascist either. He's kind of more like he kind of broadened himself more away from that. Then you have, yeah, I wouldn't count the fascist. He's more apolitical. And then you had me, and for a while I was just in the process of learning, but then when I learned things that I didn't like, my roots, which is mostly, religious roots, and I wouldn't really say conservatism, but at least some aspects of traditionalism kind of like branched away from it. So yeah, like that really leaves like almost nothing there to work with. So there aren't really too many people in the scene that make content, and there's even less of them that do debates, because most of them are not debaters, because we don't really have a fascist debate, bro, on YouTube. And even then, if you did have someone who was like a strong debater, it doesn't have to be based on, empirical evidence, reality, or any of that stuff. It could just be this mythical conception of a problem, a reaction to the problem, a solution to the problem. But anyways, I'm just making a point. So Gentili's philosophy was used to justify fascism, but it can justify just about anything in a correct context. And that's another thing too, is like, if you understand Gentili and you understand like proto-fascist philosophy, you could use that philosophy to justify anything that happens in the modern world. So if you say like neopronouns are legit because XX reason, then you can justify that. You can justify whatever the science community does with technology, whether it be like gene splicing, um, creating artificial life, transhumanism. You could pretty much use it to justify anything. And that's why around the time I started to kind of reject the ideology, I started to realize that a market socialist or a libertarian socialist could pretty much be a third positionist, or even used like um, fascist ideas to, effectively be like an imperialist, or effectively be, you know, um, a very influential thought creator, or just a personality online. And a lot of people know absolutely nothing about fascism, so it really is easy to just kind of become one in everything but name only. It could be used to justify modern America, the Soviet Union. All these are ethical, creating and actualizing a myth. And see, you do see a lot of tankies do this, is they will like use mythical stories when talking about their worldview, or just like the existence they live in. And that's something too with America too. Like, a lot of people use that myth, we're the land of the free, you know we're the land of opportunity, we're the land of freedom. And we all know those are just like bullshit abstractions at the end of the day. All of these are ethical, creating and actualizing a myth. It is relative, and the morality is anti-realist. But from this unifying of thought, we create a fascist fetish of the state. And that's the thing too, is the state becomes the all encompassing thing of your existence. So nothing outside of the state, nothing against the state. Hegel's state is not one that should obey the law of God. The fascist state is, as Eugene Weber states, something of a fraud. Now, Eugene Weber has a point, but he understood Hegel's state like calling it Platonic is odd. Herbert Marcuse does it a bit better, but I don't think he totally got what Hegel states or the fascist state. Marcuse is right in thinking this attack on fascism in relation to Hegelianism, but he is, for example, wrong when he speaks of Hegel's glorification of the Prussian monarchy. Hegel's philosophy of right was not in support of any existing state, as Knox points out, and is really the only thing fascism takes from Hegel in the view of the state, in viewing it as the actualization of consciousness and as the mind of the nation. I do not, like Marcuse, say that fascism is not Hegelian. I say it is Hegelian as in Mormonism is Christian. Many with good reason say Mormonism is not Christian. I, however, do not care to say Mormonism is or is not Christian. I do not care to call fascism Hegelian or to remove the title from it. It grew out of Hegel, and Hegel may in many ways be called a proto-fascist. Marcuse may not have the best reasoning, but he does have a point. Same with Adorno and George L. Moses' view on the homoerotic nature of fascism. The rejection of nature and viewing it as a contradiction is almost a total rejection of Hegel, however. Hegel views that it is in a dialect that causes the thing's immediate or natural being to move suddenly into its opposite. The fact we say immediate or natural being is important and must here be kept in mind. For Hegel, we are after what is the thing, and in doing so, it acts on us and we on it. For Gentili, we create the thing. And again, at the end of the science of logic, Hegel says nature and spirit are in general different modes of preventing its existence. So both exist in the absolute idea, but as being and nothing have become, as the whole and the parts have force, we see that nature and spirit have absolute idea, and we could just look at how Hegel describes philosophy already in the first paragraph of Encyclopedia. The objects of philosophy are upon the whole same as those of religion, and both the object as truth and the supreme sense of which God and God is only the truth, but in the manner go on to treat of the finite nature, of the finite worlds of nature and the human mind, with their relation to each other and their truth in God. Saying that philosophy has the one true divine God as its goal is interesting. Plotinus once said, "Our concern is not to be free from sin, but to be God." Gentili in rhetoric is not far from here, as seen in the one quote. The word philosophia is probably a rendering of an older, as of now unknown Egyptian term, but is likely a compound of many, which is love, and rek, wisdom or knowledge. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. It is God holds eternal wisdom, and the wisdom is his manifestation. Philosophy, even before the days of Egypt to now, is seeking to reach the heights of the one true God. I would like to quote Olgis Osdavenus. This doctrine is explicitly stated circa 2060 BC in the wisdom text, which emphasizes gnosis, saying that man is of knowledge, is the likeness of God, meaning a fundamental kinship of action, nature, and rank. The Egyptians also speak of it as being sun, like the transformed Ak, to reach the heights of Ra himself. The Book of Two Ways from the early Middle Kingdom states that such enlightened souls can say, "I have inherited the horizon of Ra. I am Atum." The Egyptians also speak of becoming the start of the night sky, which we can speak of an Egyptian sage like Amhotep, who started their own cult. However, Gentili is wrong in how he understands God. This moves us to the more ancient views of philosophy. Olgus Venus describes an ancient philosopher as a poetically enlightened person who follows his lived philosophia as a model way of living and dying, or of becoming like a god. For ancient philosophy, mythology is not excluded from philosophy. Yeah, exactly. Mythology isn't excluded from it. However, I may be somewhat un-Hegelian way of looking too much into these ancient views of philosophy, so let us look more to Hegel himself. Hegel gives us two important elements, the historic and the eternal element. Diego Fusaro explains these two elements in his book Marx Again. Thus, truth itself historically, although without resolving itself into the pure historical genesis, indeed, the eternal truth of the idea consists in the process of regression through the time in which it leaves itself to then return to the self enriched by the adventures of the negative, in the specific form of becoming other, which must be taken back, in which therefore is a mediation. This unity between the logical and ontological and the historical temporal level finds its most clear formulation to the Vered, to the phenomenology of the spirit, which explains of to which is eternally becomes so in its historical development as the result of mediation, as the outcome of the imminent process, processuality of the logical, ontological principles of becoming truthful. The truth is in the whole. However, the whole is only the essence which it is accomplished through its own development. In fact, it must be said that absolute is essentially a result. That is only the end for which truthfully is. Truth coincides, that is the main point, with the temporarily configured process of the truthful becoming true. Thus, we find ourselves in the presence of transcendentalism with a historical but not a historicist basis. Almost said bias for some reason, but yeah, it's basis. And the historical element, the place of determination of philosophical truths, and thus their particular genesis, in the context of truthful conception of philosophy, in which validity is universal and genesis is particular and historically determined. For Gentili, can't have this unfolding of the eternal element that acts on us and us on it. That would imply that as a part of to itself, and that is itself only, the historical element that we create in our own time. Diego Fusaro also speaks of that being, extended Giovanni Gentili, the translator of the theory of mind as pure act, points to the name actual idealism itself and almost makes it sound like Gentili does not go beyond this view of the act of thing as for Gentili absolute. And so as the eternal existing in an eternal being in an eternal present. However, Gentili attacks this Hegelian view of history in chapter 13 of the theory of mind as pure act. It must also be said that this for Gentili is the only thing that could be said to be absolute. And so we are at subjectivism. It extends it by removing an important element. If anything, this is a degeneration. Gentili speaks of the degenerate Hegelianism of the left, represented especially by Feuerbach. However, his Hegelianism is also degenerate Hegelianism. I will also add that Diego Fusaro, in his own personal philosophy, suffers from many of the same problems and incoherences of Gentili, and that, at least in his English translated works, is even more poorly argued than Gentili. I love Diego Fusaro and recommend his books, but this needs to be said. Now, for Gentili, truth is not only true. For Fusaro, there is no thing in itself. Gentili may say that he believes in any truth. Hell, this ethics involves finding the truth, and that there is no, and that is why not engaging in the thought of others is evil. But you can really call the truth that he speaks of as true? You can't. So the attack on subjective idealism, an argument of an absolute idealism made by a man who is often falsely called Hegelian Josiah Royce, can still be used on Gentili. James Wakefield wants to emphasize how Gentili is not like more vulgar forms of subjectivity, and moral relativism, however, that does not change that he still falls victim to many of the same attacks. This is what I meant when I said by removing nature, he put himself in the worst spot he accused Hegel of being in. Spaventa and his follower, Gentili believed to have found the problem in Hegel, and that their answer was to put themselves in an even worse position than Hegel. So this must be said to be degenerate Hegelianism. This paradox is wild enough if you look at it fairly, and yet many thinkers will actually have maintained it under various disguises as the doctrine for what is called the total relativity of truth. If there is no real distinction between truth and error, then the statement that there is such a difference is not really false, but only seemingly false. And then in truth, there is this distinction. Once more, try as you will to come not beyond the fatal circle, but if it is wrong to say that there is absolute truth, then the statement that there is an absolute truth is itself false. It is false and only relative. It is false only relatively. Then it is not false absolutely. Hence, the statement that it is false absolutely is itself false. Gentili states in the thinking as pure act, error is abstract. Then only is truth concrete. However, Royce was using the fact of error to prove an absolute mind. For subjective idealists like Gentili, error is, in his words, an accidental attribute to another's thinking, or thinking no longer our own. To say this, however, is absurd and incoherent. There is an infinite number of ways one can be wrong. Thus, so reaches the conclusion of an absolute mind, which determines what is true, what is false. This is a simplified version of the point Royce was making, and if error is necessary, although nothing more than an accidental abstract, then he is a sitting duck to this attack from Royce. I call him a degenerate Hegelianism, not because he modified Hegel, that is something that should be done, but because he moved it into an even worse position. Now, as we should move to how Gentili modifies the Hegelian dialectic, this has been shown a bit, but is better shown in the fourth chapter to the theory of mind as pure act. Gentili sees the problem with Hegelian dialectic as Hegel could not help but speak of fixed concepts. Being is to a degree fixed. So too is nothing. For Gentili to make the movement from nothing to being a bit difficult, there could not be that meeting together and the shock of being and nothing from which Hegel thought to strike a spark of life. Gentili then sees being and nothing as two dead things. Gentili wants to remove all concepts that are fixed in anyway, but as not the act of a thing itself to a degree fixed. The positivist can now prove positivism with their own verifiability principle. Gentili cannot escape from the one thing that he can say is to be absolute. And this one thing shows a problem. With his moderation of the Hegelian dialectic, it is in fact this is how Gentili shoves the problem in the Hegelian dialectic following his attack. The act of thinking is just as fixed as being or nothing. It must be or it is not to be. The act of thinking to remove anything that could be said to be fixed, one would have to be ontologically speaking to be a nihilist. And I don't think anyone is dumb enough to be an ontological nihilist. One would even have to remove the subjective act of thinking if we removed all that is fixed. Moreover, if we must remove anything fixed to the natural being that passes into the other, we find ourselves in an odd spot. When I speak of the tree that is out my window, that implies that the window and the tree are at least in some part in themselves. What it also implies is that the tree and the window are in some way part of the natural world. This may not be the most sound argument against Gentili, but it has a point. Gentili himself notes that in the moral problem, how odd it is that we say we set the sun. And also the tree at the window cannot be said to be totally in themselves. To only speak of them as they are in themselves, it is like the immature and patriarchal state, or the seed that is not yet the plant, or the infant, examples from Hegel. Also in Hegelianism, We speak of the reflected absoluteness of actuality. This reflected absoluteness of actuality also cannot exist in the idealism of Gentili, as it needs the thing as it is in itself to move on to the other and back into self. As I said that Gentili's idealism destroys freedom, let me explain. Hegel was looking to absolute freedom and not the mere abstract freedom. Abstract freedom is but a step in the movement to absolute freedom. This is a freedom in relation to the absolute ethical order in which we become ourselves. Gentili, too, views freedom not as a mere abstract freedom. For Gentili, then, it is a freedom in relation to the great unifying thought, i.e., the state. Freedom for the fascist comes from the state, and for Hegel, it is in relation to a more powerful force. But freedom here is from a fake absolute. Fascism has put the ascribed veritable, ultimate, and absolute being to a finite existence, so its freedom is merely subjective. So the truth of freedom is destroyed like all other truth. Freedom cannot be a truth as Gentili believes it to be. Like all other things under a subjective view of things, is meaningless. As I've shown with a quote from Royce, it is an extremely incoherent place. Under the idealism of Gentili, even if he himself would reject this conclusion, freedom cannot be real or meaningful. To make it more incoherent, can we even speak of freedom in the Gentilian dialectic? Must we say too that freedom is a dead thing? At the first look, putting man as the creator of a reality would for the maximum level of freedom. This, however, would not only be on the first look, with thinking too much, and the vulgar idea of freedom that Gentili himself and even anarchists reject. That's interesting. That is very, very interesting. So it's not just Gentili that rejects this freedom, it's also anarchist as well. Because anarchists have a very different view of freedom than liberals do. Because liberals, like, and this isn't the truth for all liberals, but some liberals think that absolute freedom is a good thing. And like with anarchists, they believe that some freedoms are good, but not all freedoms are good. And that's just a really interesting point that Lane brings up on here. But yeah, but yeah, this, however, would only be the first look into thinking with the vulgar idea of freedom that Gentili himself and even anarchists reject. So, an important thing too is fascism came from anarchism. It didn't come from liberal. You know, the only liberal element I think it borrowed from was like Mazzini and like the idea of the nation. But yeah, no, it's interesting because anarchist and fascist have a different conception of freedom than people outside of that framework. Diego Fusaro argues that the thing in itself should be rejected because it is an impediment to free human praxis. So he argues for an idealism in which the humanity is conceived as a single acting subject, fictis I Hegel spirit, is created and can be found in what is created. Fusaro speaks of a genesis of the objective and the subjective, and the Fusaro, like Gentili, also speaks of the telos of universal freedom. I point this out because the argument given by Fusaro in Europe and Capitalism is built around the free human praxis. He argues for a subjective idealism from the view of freedom. Fusaro may not want it to be called subjective idealism based off some things that he says in his work in a Spanish interview with Santiago Armacilla. He moves between what may be viewed not odd of an idealist view and what he says we adapt the object to our active subjectivity. And when he speaks of idealist history, however, Fusaro must be a subjective idealist and is one that is many of his weaknesses. Fusaro is right under materialism that there can be no free human praxis. However, going to subjective idealism was going too far. Now, like for Gentili, the freedom he is looking for is an extremely incoherent place. Moreover, Fusaro commits a crime that in Hegel's eyes would be worse than Kant's, the attack of Kant in his encyclopedia, because Kant says we do not understand the thing in itself, but Fusaro denies the thing in itself. Gentili must do the same. Hegel's own views on the thing in itself is lined out well in the chapter of existence in the science of logic. My copy does not have the sections numbered, but it is on Marxist.org that I think gives the best idea of how Hegel views the things in themselves. And I have before cited, 124 on the encyclopedia. And we must remember, like how objectivity and subjectivity are merely abstract, the thing in itself is kind of abstract. So we must remember that it is related to self as to another. And as Hegel points out, the thing and self has color in any relation to the eyes, smell in relation to the nose, and so on. Thus, we have a more full view of Fusaro than just removing it, and Marx again calling Kant dogmatic for holding on to a pneumological world. Also, in the chapter from the science of logic, also goes against the subjective idealism, and for what some now call absolute idealism, this being an argument from the relation of things, this relationship constitutes the totality of existence, writes Hegel. Gentili is, like I said before, a degenerate Hegelian, throwing away what was good in Hegel. And now on to the point about Gentili's nationalism, as his love for the Risorgimento and fascism is well known. However, Fusaro points out there is an incompatibility with Gentilianism and nationalism, and I will add to this point to show how incoherent Gentili really is. Fusaro himself is often somewhat falsely and also totally in reason attacked as a nationalist. The fourth and possibly most important point is that Gentili, in perfect idealist style, holds on firmly to the unity of the human race and elevates his idea to the level of great idealistic thinkers like Fichte and Hegel. Gentili envisions the human race as a unitary subject, creating history at the rhythm of gradual universalizing of freedom. This is a crucial point. Gentili holds on to this clearly idealistic concept. One could certainly object, but as a fascist, what his stance vis-a-vis the race laws, the horrible race laws, what was his stance on the horrible colonial invasions, Gentili, being organic to the fascist party, obviously did not oppose the race laws, but although he didn't openly oppose them, in some sense he really did, because Gentili fully supported Jewish intellectuals. So in some way he did. I consider the figure of Rudolf Mondolfo as emblematic as someone who did not only collaborate with Gentili, but whose life Gentili saved, allowing him to escape to Argentina. This is then an essential episode. I think the universalistic footprint of Gentili's thought is revealed clearly in an extract that I will read on you. I like to read some extracts from the author's work to illustrate sense of his thinking. For example, in his Fundamentals of the Philosophy of Law, Gentili writes, all human beings are, as spiritual being, one single human being with one single interest, constantly evolving and unfolding the heritage of humanity. This is the idea of the human race as a single unit, also in the philosophy of art. And I purposefully quote from several works to show how this is not just an occasional consideration, but is firmly rooted in Gentili's thought. In the philosophy of art, he writes, the journey of the human race progresses towards the enactment of human personality, a progressively self-aware thought, always broader and shared valid by a widening circle of men. This is also a very trenchant extract. Lastly, I will quote a third expert from the reform of the Hegelian dialectic. Gentili writes, the history of humanity progresses through a continental effort of willpower, constantly liberating itself through civil, economic, political, religious, and scientific struggles towards the absolute emancipation of reason, whose ideal for it, as it was fully realized, would mark the end of history. But since every ideal is realized in an infinite life, the conclusion will never come, nor will perfect ethical emancipation ever be realized. And human beings will always work towards humanization, towards fuller freedom, with a perpetual rhythm of morality and philosophy. So, although here Gentili keeps the door open for the idea of an unlimited perfectibility, he doesn't fully define his thought in this way. He also keeps the process of unlimited universalizing of freedom open. This only goes to show how incoherent Gentili really is. An introduction to Gentili's Genesis and Structure of Society We see an extant attack on fascism from British idealist Bernard Bosanquet, as he calls it, unity without a universe. No universe, no nature, so no universal. This universal humanitarian character of fascism is also not compatible with itself. You are talking about a universal when there can be no universal. It is just all incoherent. Fusaro in this quote also shows one of the problems with nationalism. The problem for nationalists is that the freedom to be freedom, it must be universal. And for moral law to be moral law, it must be universal. It may also be said for the truth to be the truth, it must be universal. Freedom is international, and so too is moral law. Truth, truth may also be said to be international, and nationalism is too the individualism of the peoples. It gets in the way of reaching the one human race. Just as nationalists will point out individualism prevents us from reaching the nation, thus I say again, nationalism is the individualism of the peoples. I am not the most well read in Kant, but it is not hard to see why he dreamed of a League of Nations. Hegel gives a weak nationalist reply to Kant here in 333 to 334 in the Philosophy of the Right. People point to the liberation. I'm sorry, I'm messing up on words. People point to the libertarian to nationalist pipeline, but ignore that both have the same logic. Nationalism is a doctrine so weak that even many post war fascists and parts of the SS started to reject it. Just as it is impossible for the materialist to declare the spirit out of existence. So the spiritualist cannot disavow the material world, said Rudolf Steiner, speaking on Fichte. He had a point. There is clearly something beyond our act of thinking. There is nature and a phenomenon out there, and Rudolf Steiner should have probably said that nature and not the material world. This may be one of the weaker attacks one can be made, but it also holds true. Diego Fusaro follows in some of the footsteps of Gentili, also in his interpretation of Marx. Diego Fusaro, who many would call a Marxist, agrees with Gentili's attack on Marxism. But not only does Fusaro agree that Marx was a poor materialist and more like an idealist, but he also adds to it. Fusaro adds that the idealism of Marx is more like the idealism of Fichte than of Hegel. This shows a Marxist response. If idealism is not a bad thing, and Marx was more like an idealist anyways, then the modification of Marx, we must adapt him to our time. We should also remove the last bits of materialism, and thus the fascist response is to build fascism with a new idealism, putting the thing in itself in a noumenal world in its proper place, and also a rebuilding of morality. First problem is that the point, does it stop being fascist? Marxism is at a point like this, and just to find some retarded tanky and ask if the Frankfurt School is Marxist, Augusto Del Noce was kind of wrong in viewing Gentili's attack in Marx as the birth of fascism. However, this brings up the questions: where is the anti? Where are? Sorry, where there were there fascist anti-Gentilians? How true is it that Gentili was the philosopher of fascism? That's a good question. Were there fascist anti-Gentilians? And how true is it that Gentili was the philosopher of fascism? There are, in fact, were anti-Gentilian fascists, but I hold that many of them were too right-wing and too reactionary to be called fascist. I think that the egoist turned fascist Berto Ricci and also Niccolo Gianni's school of fascist mysticism, both of which I am not calling right-wing and reactionary, but there is a bit more, however, to too much of it. It is in English, and I only speak English. So I will be looking into an article by an Italian female historian, Alessandra Tarquini, The Anti-Gentilians During the Fascist Regime. This article was sent to me to show how fascism is not Gentilian, but I don't think that the person who sent it to me read it. The article, first of all, notes that the anti-Gentilians had little impact on Gentili's hegemonic role in the elaboration of fascist ideology. I will also say that she probably is not the best representative of the people she talks about, like, for example, Curzio Malaparte, who signed Gentili's Manifesto of the Fascist Intellectuals. One of the more interesting people, Del Vecchio, had his professorship removed by the fascists. A review of his books makes me kind of believe she's not doing the best job explaining him. Attacking Gentili for bringing elements of liberalism and the Protestant Reformation, as many of these people do, ignores that nationalism is a product of real liberalism and the Protestant Reformation. According to the article, also, the anti Gentilians really only had one win. However, she is right in stating from all of this, it becomes clear why, as stated at the beginning of this article, one cannot resolve the complexity of fascist cultural totalitarianism into Giovanni Gentili's thought. Fascist ideology was, in fact, the manifestation of political and cultural trends that were different, but the shared principles of totalitarian conception of politics and the state. We speak of Gentili not as he was the philosopher of fascism. Fascism was too complex to nearly look at Gentili. We speak of Gentili as a man with a hegemonic role in fascist ideology. He is also the best known justifier. After I say my last statements on Gentili, I will go more deep into fascism. In thoughts on Gentili. It was said by Nicolas Gomez Davila that relativism is the solution to one who is incapable of putting things in order. Here, the Colombian Catholic Nietzsche hits at something true that we may say for Gentili and even Nietzsche. Gentili was incapable of a task which the oldest of idealists could do, and that is, he could not put nature and spirit into their place, and so created dualism, which one must be thrown out. Idealism has an incredibly rich history, and Corpus Hermeticum, there is in the 10th part some profoundly strong statements on idealism. When the mind speaks to Hermes Trismegistus, it is said that all things are full of soul and all things are properly moved by it. It is also said that there is one soul, one life, and one matter. We also hear of a universal body full of soul and mind that holds all other bodies. Before this part, Hermes Trismegistus tells Aesculapius that all bodies have spirit, and so even seeming empty air is in fact full of life and spirit. There is also, interestingly long before the two parts, is not a clear distinction between soul, mind, and spirit made. These are all interlinked deeply, and they together make up the reality. What we see is what looks to be panpsychic and monistic idealism. It is known that Hermes Trismegistus is a Greek transformation of the Egyptian god Thoth. In ancient, we can speak of idealism as Algis Us Divinus shows us in the wonderful book Philosophy is a Rite of Rebirth. We speak of the Heka or magic. We speak of no higher ontological force than Heka. This force at one point made it into the Corpus Hermeticum and is now translated into things like soul, mind, and spirit. Heka and magic are associated with speech and the power of the word. Magic, as I will say again, when we get into German idealism, magic for all things physical, noetic, and psychic exists through Heka. Divinus describes it as the main agent of demiurgy and theurgy, of descent and ascent, of living according to the truth. We may also compare none to the Platonic one and Atum Ra to divine intellect. Divinus, Plotinus also argues that the universe lies in soul, which is analogous to Osiris or Isis, Hathor in her form of the celestial cow, the soul Ba of Amun, or the breath of Shu in the psychic Osirian level. We could go deeper into the philosophy of and idealism of these ancient people from the land of the pyramids, but we only here need to show that there was an idealism. An Egyptian sage once said that the Athenian Solon, you Greeks are still children. All you know is the outcome of your own contemplation and vision. You have no ancient traditions, no wisdom hoary with age, and children will you remain. In rejecting Eurocentric views on the topic, we must remember that the Greeks looked up to the Egyptians, and so Greek idealism took from Egyptian idealism. And even the Germans took much indirectly from the Egyptians. In both, however, we do not see a rejection of nature. Nature exists through Heka, and so nature is not opposed to the spirit as nature is spirit. Rudolf Steiner did study into German idealism, speaking on both Hegel and Schelling, as he points to Jacob Bohm. Jacob Bohm is for Hegel the first German philosopher, and so when we speak German idealism, we say it starts with this humble shoemaker, read in alchemy and Kabbalah. Thus, we see the indirect impact of the Egyptians. Bohm, in his fifth point of his six mystical points, says, like the Egyptians, that the world is magic and magic is mental. Still at the start of German idealism, we do not see any rejection of nature, as here magic is the mother from which nature originates. From the idealism of the Egyptians up to the German idealism, we see idealism as not rejecting nature, but putting it into its proper place. Speaking of on Schelling, Rudolf Steiner emphasizes the role of nature, but with Hegel, he wants to emphasize the supersensible. Hegel, moving deeper into the supersensible, did not, however, deny nature, but those before he wanted to see nature in its proper place. There can still be said to be no objection between nature and spirit, as nature is spirit. One of Hegel's students, Ignaz Paul Vidal Troxler, who wanted to go even deeper into the supersensible, still did not deny nature, but like those before, wanted to see nature in its proper place. For most of the part, German idealism from Bohm to Hegel wanted to put nature in its proper place. Even when the goal of idealism was to move beyond the demiurgic natural world, it did not deny nature. Rudolf Steiner himself, on his outline of occult science, says the matter is to spirit as ice is to water. There is for most idealism rightfully no objection between nature and spirit, as nature is spirit. Gentili was wrong to deny nature, unlike those other idealists who wanted nature to be in its proper place. So that's it for part one of this article. Very interesting stuff. So let's start addressing the comments. Yes, I've seen APU on YouTube. I heard recently that there's kind of starting to reject a little bit of Nick Fuentes and America First, so I see that as a good thing. Yeah, Marx was an idealist before he called himself a materialist, and even then, Gentili was right to say that Marx was still an idealist, and even like an Italian Marxist Diego Fusaro recognizes that. So Fusaro was correct to say that as well. To be fair, I don't blame you. Oh yeah, that's related to somebody else's comment. Giovanni Gentili attacked Hegel when he felt he was wrong. It's not like fascism has some kind of right to be called Hegelian or would somehow get more reputation for it. Rocco's argument is outlined in other works. The political doctrine of fascism was a reaction to Gentili and Mussolini's document. Also, on what account of liberalism is he taking account for Rocco's view? Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like we need to start introducing longism to populists who don't know about it, because I feel like there's a lot. Yeah, no, that's like the real thing that's like the most organically American um, dissident ideology that we could think of. Didn't Gentili assume, according to James Greger, the view that Gentili's ideology is actually against solipsism on moral grounds? I'm not really sure. That would be a better question for Lane. Fascist thinks all white Americans are like Jewish people because of the American government. Well, when America was founded, Jews were considered whites. So the founding fathers, and just like the founding stock of America, had the same view of race as American Renaissance. Just saying. It was hilarious when Haas called Hitler an anarchist. It was hilarious, but from a more philosophical standpoint, I could kind of see where he is coming from, because there was some overlap. But no, Hitler's not an anarchist, but he wasn't really a conservative or a right winger either. Does Israel have massive anti-Jewish perspective of history? I don't really know about that. I just know in Israel there are like people who are anti-Zionist and they don't really agree with how the Zionists are handling things. Giovanni Gentili was never a nationalist in the bourgeois sense. Yeah. Well, I myself, I mean, I'm not really a nationalist either. I mean, the more I really looked into things, the more I just started to kind of see that nationalism doesn't really even make sense in the United States. This was one of the best critiques of Gentili I've seen. Thank you for reading this. Oh, you're welcome. There's going to be part two, but I linked the story itself in the description. So anyone who wants to actually read it on their own time, it's in the description of this video. But if you haven't seen that yet, I'll post it in the chat before I head out. But it's on Futurism's Forever. It's on Futurism Forever's website, and part two will eventually be coming out. And I'll probably read part two for you guys if you're interested, because it does kind of go into further criticisms. Yeah, no, I don't blame you LARPing as the Duchess of Burgundy. You do make a good point. And I myself, like, the more I thought about America from just a broader perspective, the more I just realized it doesn't make any sense for there to be like any kind of nationalism in this country. I mean, it makes sense to have regionalism or localism. And I think, maybe it's better that like certain communities, split up and have their own self-imposed autonomy versus, being part of a broader government. Because if you have like one city that's more socially liberal and one city that's more socially conservative, then those should just count as separate governments altogether, and they shouldn't even really count as part of a whole, since they have like completely separate cultures and completely separate identities. But anyways, that's it for this. I'll catch you all next.